Hello.
1, 2,
Yeah.
1, 2, oui. Merci beaucoup. Merci. I think we are going to start on this panel on climate change and journalism education. So welcome to everybody to this panel. And I will give you a short intro before introducing our guest. Climate crisis is now described as the main challenge for humanity in the years to come and in the next decades. But reporting on those issues is quite tricky. This is a global and systemic problem requiring many different skills, knowledge in science, geopolitics, but also in narratives. To have people understanding and getting involved into action to adapt to climate change, journalists need to tell their story in a very specific way. What do junior journalists learn about that in their schools? How to train them to report on climate crisis and energy transition properly. To answer those questions, we have gathered 4 experts. Let me introduce them to you. We have Abaas Mpindi. You are the CEO of the Media Challenge Initiative, which was launched in 2012 in Uganda. We have Tézenas. You are working as a freelance journalist for the French media, and you also teach journalism at IPJ Dauphine here in Paris. Ramesh Bhushal, you are based in Nepal, where you are the South Asian content coordinator of the Hearst journalism network. And Workine Kelbesa, you teach philosophy at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. And I'm Jennifer Gallé. I'm working for a new media launched in France in 2015, The Conversation France. And I'm covering environment issues for that media. Before entering our discussion, I would like to open the panel with you, Workine, before talking more precisely about reporting on climate change and education about climate change. You wanted to come back to keys, ideas on global warming for young journalists. So maybe you just go there and then just tell us about those main ideas you want to share with us.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and UNESCO for inviting me to this very important conference. Now, my presentation is divided into 3 parts. In the first part, I will briefly look at the nature of climate change. And then the second part is climate change is fundamentally an ethical issue, and then the relationship between climate ethics and journalistic education. First of all, we should note that climate change is one of the urgent problems humanity is facing. It's not working. Oh, all right. So, climate change is not a problem of the future, because we have already faced a number of problems, including, for example, flooding, deadly heat waves, droughts, increasing tropical diseases, forest fire, conflicts, and so on and so forth. In addition to this, climate change is also a human rights issue because it violates the fundamental human rights human beings are required to have. And one can say that there are 2 causes of climate change, but the fundamental causes of climate change include human activities, particularly the 5th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has noted that human activities are responsible for climate change. And climate change is a reality in many parts of Africa, in many parts of the world, particularly in Africa. Although Africa has contributed about 4% to global warming, Africa has been paying the price because of this climate change. So we have a number of problems. But there are some climate skeptics who doubted the reality of climate change. They use different arguments to discredit climate science and at the same time the reality of climate change. The first one is particularly conservative commentators tend to consider anthropogenic climate change as a means perpetrated by liberals who are not really responsible for what they say and for what they have been doing. So for this, they identified about 4 major reasons. The first one is scientific uncertainty. So they believe that science does not prove the very existence of climate change. So they appeal to, among others, opinion pieces in newspapers, blogs, industry-sponsored position papers, and even vanity journals that are not peer-reviewed articles. And particularly fossil fuel companies have discredited climate science. And they use different methods to question this, particularly the very existence of climate change. So fossil fuel companies have used the following morally indefensible tactics to question climate science: reckless disregard for the truth, the exaggeration of unknown facts and avoidance of known facts, manufacturing fake climate science, creation of bogus economic arguments, cyberbullying of scientists and journalists. So when, for example, climate scientists and climate ethicists produce some articles, they really attack them. They hired scientists to attack climate scientists and, at the same time, climate ethicists. And again, developed countries fail to pay their own fair share to address the problem of climate change. But there are some who are against this argument. For example, one writer, after examining about 928 articles on climate change, published from 1993 to 2003, confirmed that the major conclusions of IPCC are really true. And again, numerous reputable scientific organizations, beginning in the late 1970s, including the academic science for the GS plus 5 other countries, including Brazil and other major countries. And again, the 5 reports of the IPCC confirmed that human activities are responsible for climate change. And again, some leading global companies, in addition to this, for example, Alcan, British Petroleum, and others also confirmed that, yes, we have contributed to climate change. However, there are uncertainties about the future manifestation of climate change. We don't have 100% perfect about climate change. For example, we don't know about the regional patterns of climate change and impacts. According to one writer, Garvey, quote, "We do not fully understand what the carbon sinks of the world are up to, nor is the influence of clouds on the magnitude of climate change." So sometimes, therefore, reasonable skepticism is also important. So in addition to scientific uncertainties, climate skeptics also use cost. Because if you force, for example, developed countries and corporations to address climate change, that will be very expensive for them. As a matter of fact, they suggest that they don't need to consider these problems. And the second reason against action is technological rescue. So some believe that technology can help us to address this climate change. So there is no reason to worry about climate change. However, although climate change is important to address this problem, it also creates problems because technology is the creator of values and at the same time the destroyer of values. Therefore, we have to be very careful about climate change. And biofuels, for example, have contributed to deforestation. And others suggested that we have to wait until others, for example, China, India, and so forth, participate in these activities. For example, the US government said we shouldn't try to address this problem. So we have to wait others to participate. And another reason is, don't worry about climate change. God will help us. Therefore, we shouldn't worry about this. But this is not really a good argument. The second part of my presentation is ethics, climate change, and the need for global climate justice. Particularly, philosophers were late in addressing this problem. So they started to discuss these issues in the first decade of the 21st century. But before philosophers embarked on this debate, other scientists and at the same time other thinkers tried to address this problem. But when you look at this problem, the study of climate change is necessarily interdisciplinary. It is not only a philosophical problem. In fact, climate change is fundamentally an ethical issue because this, according to one writer, for example, Jamison, an American philosopher, besides scientific concerns, the problem of climate change is related to our values. It is about how we ought to live and how humans should relate to each other and to the rest of nature. So these are problems of ethics and politics, as well as problems of science. So the study of climate change is interdisciplinary. It's different disciplines can contribute to the solution of climate change. Right, okay, so
5 more minutes.
So climate change is fundamentally an ethical problem because the contributors of climate change are developed countries. But the major victims of climate change are developing countries, poor people who are living in developing nations. That is the first reason. The second reason is climate change impacts are potentially catastrophic for many of the poorest people around the world, if not the entire world. And thirdly, one nation cannot address climate change alone. So it requires the intervention of different nations. In addition to this, climate issues such as responsibility and historical accountability for the causes of climate change, duties to future human and non-human generations also include ethical issues. However, the world's attempt to address climate change seems to have fallen far short of taking ethics and justice seriously because many countries rely on their own vested interest, economic interest, and fail to address climate change. For example, some countries fail to sign the Kyoto Protocol, and at the same time they withdrew from the second round of the Kyoto Protocol. So because of this, therefore, they fail to address these issues. So some ethical principles, including the no-harm principle, the polluter pays principle, and global emissions trading can help us to address climate change. According to American philosopher, a leading climate ethicist, on the basis of the current ethical discussion and at the same time scientific achievement, we need to address the following 6 points. First, the enormous magnitude of greenhouse gas emissions reduction need to prevent catastrophic warming. And again, developing countries are required to help developed countries are required to help developing countries to address this problem. And we cannot simply rely on economic reason to stop making some activities and address this climate change. So the last part of my presentation is climate ethics and journalism education. So first of all, we can talk about the failure of the media. Particularly journalists, a number of journalists fail to understand the nature of climate change and address this problem. Particularly the international media has failed to cover the obvious ethical and justice raised by climate change. We can consider, for example, the US government, the withdrawal of the US government from the Paris Agreement and the American media. American journalists are silent about this. But when you look at this, the Trump administrator's action is ethically indefensible and tragic. So their activities in their own country have negative impacts, particularly on developing countries. The next one is climate ethics for journalists. The media has an important role to help us understand our own world. Therefore, what we require is ethical journalism. So journalists need to understand climate science and climate ethics. And ethics stress about the nature of future generations and at the same time the interests and demands of non-human beings and the health of Mother Earth. Therefore, climate journalists are also required to understand this problem. So they should understand and educate citizens about the ethical dimensions of climate change policy formation. In fact, some journalists have been speaking about climate change with rigor. So journalists need to take a long-term and broad view rather than a short-term or narrow one. journalists also need to understand enough geography to understand the impact of climate change in different parts of the world, and at the same time, the nature of climate science itself. If they don't understand the nature of climate science and at the same time geography, it is difficult for them to even understand climate ethics. So that is very important. Let me conclude my presentation. First, environmental ethicists, journalists, and civil society organizations ought to raise public awareness about the danger of climate change and the attendant ethical issues. In particular, journalists should be accountable to the public and to sources and reference rather than to the state and employers. Secondly, climate change requires an interdisciplinary approach linking studies of scientific, environmental, ethical, political, and socioeconomic spheres. And as I've said earlier, climate change is fundamentally an ethical problem. And developed countries which have contributed a lot to climate change are required to address this problem and at the same time help developing nations. And finally, global problems do not have frontiers and affect all human and non-human beings and require international ethical thought and international cooperation of governments, scientists, journalists, and citizens. I would thus suggest to reduce the respective emissions, different nations should engage in genuine dialogue that respect global justice and equality. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Wakine. Thank you for explaining like all the concepts, the ideas that are needed to see how global the climate change is and tricky and complex. And thank you for that. Now I would like to move to more experimental journalism, like what is happening on the field when you have to report about climate change. And Anne, I would like to start with you, to start the discussion with you. You move from economic journalism to climate change coverage. What did you learn as a journalist in that process from going to one field to another?
Hello, everybody. Actually, I'm still doing economic journalism and in parallel climate change coverage. It is important because I think, as you just said, that the main issue in terms of education is the fact to be interdisciplinary. So first, I'm going to tell you my personal story about that, because I really discovered this issue by chance, by accident, I would say. And it was in 2007, and it began with a comic. I mean, I was asked to participate to a comic with George Wolinski, who maybe you know his name because he was one of the most famous cartoonists of Charlie Hebdo newspaper. So I was supposed to write about the script of the comic with him, and I didn't know nothing about it, about climate change issues. And of course, I began to read, and when I began to read, then I didn't stop reading about it. And my first surprise was why this fundamental issue, which is so important, as you just said, is not on the front page every day in media. That was, and I still have this question in mind. So after this experience, I worked on, we tried to sell to UNESCO another version of this comic, which was kind of alert on climate change. So if some of you want to see it, I will share it with you. And then after, I decided with a colleague of mine to publish a book about Anthropocene era, which is maybe the global notion, which is very important because we're not talking only about temperature rise, but about civilizational change, which is Anthropocene era, and this is a very important issue. Then, because of this book, and I really say thank you to the writers of this book. I was asked to be the only journalist embedded in French diplomatic teams working on Paris Agreement adoption. I spent almost 3 years with them, and I had the privilege to have a negotiator accreditation. So I was able, which is not possible for any journalist on COPs, to participate, of course not talk, but to observe negotiation sessions, and that was a very unique experience. And during these years, I wrote regularly in a magazine called Le Parisien magazine. Then after, I was recruited in the new part of Paris Agreement called Action Agenda, which has for mission to boost non-state actors' climate action. So it was a very new part, and I'm very proud to have participated to the first UN official synthesis of the work of 600 coalitions representing businesses and many different business areas, sectors, oceans, transport, etc. So to come back to your question, Jennifer, it was important for me just to make the link between my two backgrounds, which are first economic and then climate change. My first surprise when I arrived for the first time in a COP, it was in Warsaw in 2013, was to realize that what we were talking there about was economy, was money. There was an incredibly tough discussion between developed countries and developing countries about who is going to pay for the energetic transition, the decarbonation of our economies, whether they are new or old economies. My second surprise was that in COP there was no economic journalist there, none, only environmental journalists. And it is still true. And as I'm not a specialist of environment, but I have an economic background journalist, I realized how this mismatching was terrible, because if the rise of temperature, and as you said, is linked to human activities, it means that the human activities that that come from companies, cities, and all the economic actors, if these actors are not aware of their responsibility, it will never change. I mean, we can publish as many articles about risks, about catastrophes, but if we don't publish about what all businesses and sectors have to do to change and to organize this decarbonation, we will never be on time to respect the Paris Agreement objective.
Okay, thank you, Han, for that. It's a good overview of the issues that you are confronting when reporting on climate change. Abaas, can you tell us about the way you are trying to do like this global journalistic approach with the people who are taking part of the Media Challenge initiative that you are leading? And can you tell us a bit more about this initiative, why you set up this initiative, and maybe to tell us like what is the part of climate change coverage within your programs?
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Abaas Mpindi. I come from Uganda, Kampala. Maybe to start with the story of Media Challenge Initiative, which is the organization I started. Now, it's really rooted in a personal story. I don't know how many of you have been in Uganda or any other developing country, but just imagine yourself as a young journalist walking into a media house to ask for an internship. and only to be told that you need someone from inside to recommend you for an internship. In my world, ideally, I'm thinking that I don't need a recommendation for an internship. I have a letter, you either have or you don't have. But things like that happen, and in another world, you can call it technical know-who. If you know someone somewhere, you get in. So out of the desire to create, a connection between the media and the journalism students, as a journalism student, then I started a university competition which brought together universities to compete and showcase their skills and talents to different media houses. The rationale is that if you see me in action, then you'll be able to give me an opportunity as an editor. So if I surround you, for example, as an editor, the conversation with over 100 young, talented students, it's possible that you will pick some of their talent and take them on. So that's how we started. Now we have a full-fledged organization that does boot camps in the universities. We train journalism students by taking our mobile newsroom there.
How many journalists do you train per year? You have how many of them do you train per year, every year? Like hundreds of journalists?
We actually work with 17 universities, so we support over 1,000 students through our boot camps, and after the boot camp, we organize a fellowship program for the top young journalists who go through 25 days of multimedia training. It's then that experience that brings in the idea of knowledge-based journalism. And that's how every year we have a theme. So this year we're focusing on climate change and disaster risk reduction. Uganda, for example, is an agriculture country, so we are basically depending on the rain. That means any impact in rain disruptions will also influence the food, will influence different things, food security, gender, households' incomes, and everything. And what I've realized is that there's really a huge information gap. And that comes from what I think the professor has also been talking about in terms of the journalists themselves who are environment reporter may not be able to understand this idea of climate change. Now, when you go to institutions, the first big challenge that you find is that it's not even something that is taught. So you have environment reporting as a generic, but there is no time to go deep into the aspects of climate change. So that means students will get out of the university until they join a media house to get an experience where they report about a conference on climate change. It's therefore on them to do research and to understand that. But also remember that the curriculum is highly organized around skills. So you push people to learn a skill in editing, a skill on data journalism, but not on issues that are facing the world. So that becomes a big problem because then by the time someone moves out of the university, they are really focusing on, can I edit? Can I produce a video? But rather, do I understand the problems that face my community? And climate change is definitely one of those challenges that face the communities in Uganda.
I think you raised a very important point about like the training and the background of each of those young journalists. And Ramesh, I would like to ask you, because you have another different background. You are coming from science. You are a scientist at in the first place, and then you went to journalism. So what is your experience regarding like the skills in journalism covering climate change and environmental issues, but like more generally, did you feel like you needed, are you happy being a scientist going to journalism and not the reverse? I mean, that because you have this
Thank you. Actually, I became a journalist by accident. I was hosting a program and some of the audience was a radio owner, and she came and said, I want to give you a job. I was doing my bachelor's degree and I was so fascinated. And she said, like, your voice is so good, come to my radio. I started, that way. And when I went to radio, I felt like, I do really have the capacity to tell people the things in a better way. And then after working a few years in radio, I moved to newspapers because I want to be more deeply, reporting on environmental issues. And then I went to BBC's radio in Nepal for a couple of years as science reporter. So the background that I have always has helped me to understand the complexity of this global climate change science. And the Earth is complex anyway. It is culturally complex. It is, linguistically complex. And the Earth is geographically complex. And I mean, there are a lot of complexities. But when we talk about climate change, it is so global. For example, if you say the Earth is warming, at certain degrees per decade, and that's average of all, from Mount Everest to the sea. So, as temperature is so specific to the place, you have to report it at a global scale, at a regional scale, the national scale. How do you segregate it? So science is very based on modules. It is very based on procedure. It is very based on protocol. So if you don't understand how science works and how knowledge is generated, you won't understand how to report it back, right? So always when you talk about climate science, there is one thing called if, right? For example, there is a big research which says all the glaciers will melt by 2100. But there is a very bold statement. It says if the world goes in this trend, but it may not go. So how do you simplify, how do you understand these uncertainties and tell the stories to people? It is very hard because unless you don't know the bits and pieces of the science, you will not be able to really simplify it. Sometimes you oversimplify, sometimes you exaggerate. And journalism has always been in between, trying to less simplify but people understand, not exaggerate because you will not be credible, right? So the background in science has helped to understand a bit about the background of knowledge generation, and I think that is the most important thing. But a lot of time, our reporting globally, regionally, and nationally, what happened was almost like 3 decades, we said either climate change is happening or not. So world war was divided between whether it is happening or not. So, and it has impacted at individual level, because when you have such a debate at global level, there's so many things in around, you can't be able to identify how to report, what to report, right? So within that complex uncertainty, there is a really, really deep divide between even the, on the issue. So basically, what I want to start from is like, climate change is not a problem. We have always reported climate change as a problem for 3 decades or 4 decades. Now people have realized it is not a problem. If, for example, there wasn't climate change, believe me, how would we have, excavated this planet? How much resources we have, taken from the Earth? So the climate change came at a time where we were not thinking about the planet as a limited resource. We are thinking planet is so unlimited. We can do everything. But the climate change came as a problem. And now if you see, a lot of things are happening. Solars are increasing, wind is increasing. I mean, people are trying to get something new. People are innovating something new. I think this is a very nice juncture of our history, where people always were thinking in a unit direction, like saying, we can develop, we can be prosperous, we can be rich. But at a time, we saw, oh, no, there is something that we shouldn't do it. And it came in between. I think climate change has come as a problem, but we should take it as an opportunity. And then the reportings, more and more reportings, should be trying to tell the realities, opportunities to live in this planet. And also, climate change will not divide. It will really link you and me. If you feel that, I'm near to Mount Everest, you're near to, to the sea. If we see, oh, the glaciers in Mount Everest has a value for me as well, and you start, thinking about each other, I think it will help to connect us rather than, divide us. So I think this, if we report well, I think climate change will be an opportunity to really, link each other and tell better stories.
Thank you. That's very a clever way to see climate change as a chance, as a chance to be more, to get together. Anne, I would like to go back to one of the points you are underlying regarding the young journalists, because you are teaching journalism at IPJ Dauphine. What do you think about their level? I mean, their science level. Do they know well? Do they know well this complexity? Do they are aware of this complexity, and do they are aware of everything that they will need to do to try to have like this global approach of climate change?
No, they're not. They're not because no one teach them to be able to understand this complexity. And I have a very concrete example about that. We were talking yesterday about rare metals with Rameshs, rare earth. All these very metals
parts.
who are in your smartphones, and they are everywhere. And but to get them, you have to mine like on any natural resources. And if you don't understand the war to control these rare metals, you don't understand why some journalists are killed. You don't understand why there's a link with climate change, and you don't understand the economy. So, if we really want to take seriously this issue, we have to be serious and do it properly. And just to work on issues that look separated, that are usually treated separately, like economy, like environment, like ecology, and then to make the link between them, to give to the students a real big picture. If not, let's forget it. I mean, we will be, I don't know the word in French, but in English, the complice. Complice? No?
Complice?
The complicit of inaction. And if you wait for media, which are your clients, like youth is your client, nothing will happen, because media, in which economic situation media are today. So you have a moral responsibility to do something and to prepare students to be able to push these issues in the media where they are going to work. And if not, the timing is so short. We were talking last week with Jennifer about it, and you said that it was only 10 years. We often think that we have to be ready in 2040, 2050, but the last research said it's really shorter. So, well, as you say, it's always terrible for me to speak in front of almost empty rooms on a major issue. Sorry, I won't do like a priest that say every Sunday to the rare present that there is a problem not to be here every Sunday, but sometimes it's difficult to see. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to add something, is that yesterday or the day before, like some university signed a proposal by an organization called Shift Project to integrate climate change education for the university students. So I think that things are moving, not fast enough, but things are evolving, and the stuff, but we can talk about this a bit later, the stuff is to try to set programs that are really adapted, not, as you said, going through skills, but through like the issues. But we can talk about that a bit later.
I just wanted to add on her, like, I don't know the newsrooms in developed countries, they are well resourced, they have, good teachers. But the newsrooms in developing countries, a lot of the people who become environment journalists become by accident, because they don't have syllabus. They go to the newsrooms and they work for 5-7 years and they realize, oh, Tiger's news was fantastic, and everybody liked it. So I'll become the environment journalist after 7 years, 8 years. So newsrooms are not really adapting the new science. And second thing is very important. I mean, the very important thing in developing country is that there's a level of fear within the journalists saying, oh, climate change is so complex, science is so complex, I can't report. I'll go to politics because I'll get a quote from a minister and write a news, and I'll get connected with them. I'll be a star reporter very soon. So the fear that is within the newsroom, I mean, within the individuals, and that was created by certain ways, because people go to journalism, they don't want to engage themselves in a deeper ways in science or something. And if you cannot crash those fears at individual level, they won't be environment or science reporters. So we need to crack that. We need to cross that and say, no, climate science is not complex. It is complex to do a PhD, yes. If you want to be a scientist, yes, it is complex. You have to spend 5-7 years. But if you want to report about rivers, you don't need to do morphology. You need to understand reverse morphology. I mean, reporting climate change and working on climate change is different. So we should always try to encourage journalists or young people telling that, remove your fear and report back about forest, report back about rivers, report about geology, report about hydrology. It is not that complex as you think or people say. I think that is what we need to do in the newsrooms in the university before they go to newsrooms.
Yeah, the thing as well is that you're talking about almost the old way to do the news. You go on the field, you try to understand, you connect people. It's not only wire or internet based. It's not just gathering stuff that you find online. It's just like going, as you said, a bit deeper. And when you talk about fear, we also need to talk about danger, because we know that environment journalists, they are in the front line of they can be killed. I mean, reports of people being killed every year in covering Amazonian deforestation, for example. It's like journalists in environment field that are really in the front line of danger, not only fear. But Abaas, I have another question for you regarding the programs that you are setting and trying to talk about specifically climate change. What do you need the most today to achieve this education that you are providing? And also because we are talking about complexity, but you are setting very short programs. I mean, you are trying to having people into journalism very quickly. So how do you manage to do this quickly and at the same time address this complex climate change stuff?
Thank you, Jennifer, so much. Before that, I wanted to, also add, when you look at the market as well, so you have a young journalist coming out of the university. They go to a newsroom, they do a story on environment or climate change, for example. That story does not get published. Or it comes at a certain time in the supplements. That's level number one of demotivation. And the simple answer is even the challenge, not just the universities, but even the market where you're sending a young journalist to work. If the newsroom arrangement does not allow for it, providing space for these stories, and you are in a space that you are paid per story, it means I don't want to do any story that will not be published, because then at the end of the month I have very little money. Then the other challenge that I've also, interacting with different professors, that the current training or lecturing really responds to the current needs of the market. So we are not projecting what's going to happen in the next 20 or 40 years. And that's really in the context of a curriculum in Uganda or any other country in the developing world. So we're more now in a reactionary phase where we're saying, oh, now climate change is a big issue, or refugees is a big issue, and that's okay. But how do we now, something that everyone is saying is for the future, how do we now also make sure that people understand that? Now, I do short training programs because that's the capacity we have. But we already know that they get the theory at their universities. So the space we have allows them now to think about, there is a whole thing around covering climate change, for example. I could focus on that. We allow them to think out of the usual box that they are in at the university so that they can now come into a space that gives them opportunity to do some research or interact with an expert on climate change. And that helps to provide the opportunity for them to practice. The other thing that is really important to train people about something that is very complex and scientific is that let them experience it. When we were young in primary school, we had like geography trips. So they would take you to like River Nile and you see just the river, or they will take you to the airport and they say this is the airport of Uganda, which was always exciting. And when you come back as a geography student, you remember of mountains or anything. At the university level, that kind of experience is not there anymore. To actually have, we're talking about climate change, take students to a community that is facing landslides in eastern Uganda, for example, and take them to the Institute of Meteorology, where you can be able to scientists can explain to them how, Uganda being in this phase, what it means for farmers in the communities. It's abstract, and let them experience it in terms of what does it mean to a woman in my local community if there is drought, for example. What does it mean to the farmers? What does it mean for the coffee market in the country if we're going 2 degrees? And that is, for me, what is important is let's look at the community needs. Let's look at what climate change is doing to affect those needs and what it means to that young journalist who is doing a story, because it's coming from first and foremost, it's very personal. I'm looking at my community and how it's going to be affected. And I think the other part that we don't really do is, which I'm trying to do through the program, is supporting young people to connect the dots. So what is, the connection between climate change and gender? And explaining to them that a woman in a local community who, the community that is facing droughts or floods will be the only person usually that stays in that community, because the husband and the kids will run away to Kampala, in the capital city. And what it means is that that person stays in the village, taking care of their house and everything, and that's a lot of pressure on that woman. Or when you have issues to do with there's no food in the community because now you have drought and you are forced to, as a woman, it's women who are forced to look for food, and you come back home and your husband is saying, hey, where's the food? And there's now violence in the family. So when you connect those, the intersection between climate change, gender, climate change and security, climate change and poverty, and climate change and education, where you can't go to school because the bridge has been destroyed by floods, then people begin to get it. And the young journalist then reports with a very connected mind. Yeah,
thank you. So it's really like taking back this global, this big issue to the local, very community level. I mean, what is happening in everyday life, people facing climate change. I will just want to ask.
Add just one point.
Okay.
For example, in terms of experiencing experiential training that I'm trying to do right now, is I am fundraising for a mobile van that takes students from a university to a community through a mobile studio, train them how to report about climate change, have them go to the community, support other youth in terms of planting trees and tracking the waste in their community, and then take them back to the university and create a mobile cinema where they can actually see documentaries and have conversations around that. And then they can create a social media campaign around that whole process, which becomes an experience for
using
them.
the new tools to report, like very close to the people. Working. What about the media coverage on climate change in Ethiopia? how do you qualify it? Is there a lot of stories about climate change in the Ethiopian media or not? What do you think about that?
No, thank you, Madam Chair. The Ethiopian government has formulated its own environmental policy, particularly the current government in 1997. And again, after that, it's also adopted international agreements. And particularly in 2011, the Ethiopian government tried to promote climate-resilient green economy. So the hope is Ethiopia will arrive at middle-income country in 2025, and at the same time, climate-resilient green economy. So the government also emphasized different issues. The government cooperated with the international community. But the problem is we have very few journalists who cover these issues, because most of the time journalists try to cover political issues, and they try to follow politicians and try to discuss these issues rather than this important environmental problem. So, in fact, as I said, there are some journalists, particularly including my own students in my university. I teach environmental ethics, among others. Climate ethics is one component of environmental ethics. So one of my students who took this course, along with other colleagues, his colleagues, established the Association of Environmental Journalists in Ethiopia. So some of the members of this organization try to cover climate change issues. And in some media, at the same time, they have weekly radio and TV programs. So very often they try to discuss these issues. But generally, climate change is not well covered in our country. So because of the certain reasons. Yeah.
Thank you. Ramesh, maybe some, because we are talking about more precise, more examples. What about the Hearst journalism network? How does it work? And within this network, you are mentoring young journalists. So what do you do? Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, I mean, it was created 15 years ago by a journalist who used to work in Bangkok. He's American. He is a teacher at Berkeley now, J School. So he thought, while reporting climate change and other issues, he found that a lot of people in developing countries, they don't have the capacity to really understand, and also they don't have resources to really understand this global process, politics. I was in Paris in 2009, where Barack Obama was near to us, Xi Jinping was there, Narendra Modi was there, 200 leaders were discussing for 15 days. And then, if you don't see all those global processes, you won't be able to understand the climate change at larger perspective. So they started doing this kind of helping journalists with resources. One is like giving travel fellowships, for example. It's a competitive basis. You call for application, you search some money, you select a few journalists, take them to larger global conferences, and make them to talk to each other, network with each other, go to scientists, interview them, learn more and more, and report back to your own media outlet. The second was in the newsroom, as I have worked in the newsroom where there's so less resources. I want to do a fantastic story. It is multimedia story. I have to travel 15 days, but my media house doesn't give money. So every day I have to produce a story. Every day I have to produce a story, but I want to do something that is so good, but I don't have money. So if I have $1,000, I would have traveled for 15 days, brought a lot of things, come back and write a fantastic piece or do fantastic, audio or video report. So if I get such kind of small fellowships where you don't tell me what I need to do, I know what I need to do, then if you give me some resources, I will expose myself. I will try to go to the field and bring the voices of this climate change stories. So we have given hundreds and hundreds of fellowships in the last 15 years. I think we have trained more than 4,000 journalists in the last 15 years all over the world. And it is life-changing. It will change whole perspective. If I hadn't been a fellow with the Earth Journalism Network in 2009, I wouldn't have got all these opportunities to really understand more and more, right? So at individual level, it will help individual journalists who are with less resourced to get more insights, and also it would also help to dig more and more about the stories that they want to do within newsrooms. I think that is what the basics was. Basically, it was established to enhance environmental journalism in quality and quantity. So quality means if you train somebody, then you will increase the quality of report that he or she will do. And quantity means we need more and more environment news. We need more and more environment in the front page. We need more and more environment journalists to come in. So it is, moreover, increasing the quality and quantity of environmental issues and journalists all over the world. And I think we really focus on that. And I, as personally, what I do is I also do trainings, mentorings, but I also do stories. Like I do, stories like multimedia pieces in every 3 or 4 months. I travel for a few weeks and then,
what was the last? What was the last story you covered? Can you give us an example?
Oh, I mean, there are many, but I did one story that the China is trying to cross the Himalayas from the 4,000 meters, bring the railways to Nepal, to India. That's a very crazy idea, crossing all these mountains at 4,000 and bringing the railways to the south. And there's a lot of debate about how Nepal will cope with. What are the environmental impacts? Are we talking about it? Those kind of things. And the second story I did was I traveled all the way from Tibet to India for 45 days along the river with the team of scientists and produced a 5-part series. Normally, journalists don't get those kind of opportunities to really go for 45 days with a scientist along the river, raft for 10 days, walk for 25 days, 15 days in vehicle from China to India, crossing whole Nepal and the remotest part of the world.
Sounds amazing. Where did the story get published? You get like published in different newspapers or media? Or?
Yeah, I mean, normally I publish the stories in the thirdpole.net. Third pole means Himalayas from Myanmar to Afghanistan. That is 3,000 kilometers of the range of the mountain, including Mount Everest, is the third largest ice mass on this planet. So that's called third pole. Basically, we work on third pole in South Asia, but it has been published by so many other outlets in India, in Nepal, in China, because our stories are republished by very good outlets in different countries in South Asia and China as well. So it was published in different languages. For example, my latest story was published in Nepali, Chinese, English, by 5 or 6 media outlets in the last 2 weeks. So it is more like, republishing that article. If I do good stories, people want it. They don't have resources to do by themselves. So if you are credible, if you do a story in a better way, there are outlets who are really wanting to publish your content. But you have to have your own capacity and also do stories. If you can do better stories, I think, I don't agree with the media is not publishing stories. There is other parties. We are also not producing good content as well. How do you enhance that capacity and tell journalists that produce good content that people want to read it, right? So I think there's a mix of, yes, there's something that media don't want because they have this marketing. They want to do other things. There are other issues around. But if you have good story, there are so many who want to publish. Okay. So we have to balance both in a way.
Okay. Abaas, can you, listening to Ramesh, I think you get maybe new ideas for your short program, but can you tell us what inspires you the most? I mean, what do you have like other projects in Africa, a bit like yours, that you can work with, or you can maybe work within a network? Do you have, are there other projects like yours in Africa that could work together?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that we may be the only youth journalism full-time program in East Africa, especially working with journalism students. There are some, one-offs that happen, small trainings here and there, but in terms of having a project that runs for a whole year and continuous, I think we may be the only ones doing that. And I totally agree that producing good stories will get readership, will get viewership, and also publish and being published. What inspires me is I believe that journalism can make the world a better place. And that depends entirely on the stories that journalists do and the intention behind those stories. So when I work with young journalists, this is what the idea and the value of them looking at the world in terms of their role, not only as journalists, but also as leaders, because we set the agenda. So at the end of the day, they should also be inspired to produce stories or news that aim at making the world a better place for everyone else. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe before closing the discussion, and maybe we have a short Q&A session at the end of the talk, I would like to ask Anne about this idea, because we are talking, I mean, this is a broad and global issue, but we are here to talk about also training young journalists. And ahead of this meeting, you had this idea of like trying to work together on a global training program. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
The idea is very simple. It's to mutualize our different resources as schools, but maybe people from this panel too, to create an online curriculum on climate change coverage. So to do something very concrete that will be in different languages, and it could be used by students, and with a short, with a short timing, the idea would be to be ready next September. So if some of you are ready to participate, I will be really glad to share my knowledge, experience about it, and to be able collectively to give more tools to young students to understand this issue, which is really, we often forget that behind this environmental issue there is one question, is where is the money? And if we don't do this link between economic interests and environmental issues, we have half of the problem in mind. So it's very important to have a bigger picture in mind.
But just to be more precise, the idea will be to have like maybe one program that will be the same in different countries, and then you can adapt locally.
Yes, I mean,
in each school.
Yes, as you know, there are different scales in the issue. You talked about your country and some very local communities issues, but there are global scales. I think we can manage to analyze the global scale and share this analysis and share them with your students and our students. On the local aspect, on national aspects, every school which is interested in the project could feed this hub, information hub, with national aspects. So we could share and progressively develop a knowledge database on climate change, but made for journalists. That's very important because you've talked about stories. We need stories. I mean, that's our job. We're not researchers. We need stories. And when I worked on this UN document, I tried for 1 year to ask to these 600 coalitions to send me stories about what they were doing on the field. They didn't understand what I was asking for. We have a specific mindset. These climate actors have another mindset. We need to create a translation box. If not, the audience won't understand what's happening there. And it's very important. We are in a very important moment, not only in terms of environmental aspects. As you know, youth is pushing in Europe specifically, but I think globally, to ask adults to take their responsibilities on these climate change issues. And so there is a very big temptation in economic fields to do a maximum greenwashing during the next 10 years and minimum real actions. Today, we're not able as journalists to assess the reality of Paris Agreement implementation. And as you probably know, Paris Agreement is not, it's not an obligation, it's a bottom-up treaty. So if journalists don't do their job of looking at what are doing private and public institutions on this regard, I mean, greenwashing risks to really be massive.
Okay, maybe Workine, what do you think about this idea of a global, like a global program that could be implemented in the journalism school around the world that could have this common program? Do you think it could work to make a report on climate change more efficient?
Yes, as I've said earlier, one country alone, or one region alone, cannot address the problem of climate change, in particular, and environmental problems in general. And sometimes we simply talk about climate science, climate ethics, and so on and so forth. In addition to this, we should also seek the knowledge of indigenous people. Indigenous people have their own knowledge. They have their own adaptation systems. So they are more knowledgeable than scientists who have been reading books and so on and so forth. And most of the time, climate policies are imposed on the people. So different governments, including my own government, use top-down approach. So that makes the solution of climate change incomplete. Therefore, climate scientists and at the same time journalists, particularly young journalists, should also go to the field and try to study what is going on in rural areas. Otherwise, they simply sit down in the city and approach climate scientists and try to propose solutions to the problems of climate change. That doesn't work. Because we have to use both indigenous climate science and at the same time modern climate science. My brother, you said, journalism will make the world a better place. Journalism cannot make the world a better place without ethics. That is why I've said that climate ethics is very, very important, particularly young journalists who are energetic and so on should try to study this. So let me finish.
Yeah.
So particularly when we look at the atmosphere, in the recent past, many people believe that the atmosphere is inexhaustible. Some people thought that oceans are inexhaustible, so we can drop most of our waste in oceans, so we don't face any consequences. But that is no longer true. In this connection, Hardin talked about the tragedy of commons. If you, for example, we have one pasture land, if it is open to all individuals, each individual should try to exploit this. And finally, this pasture land will be destroyed. But particularly indigenous people in my own country, the Borana people in the south, who are also close to Kenya, have indigenous methods of dealing with these commons. So when individuals try to overexploit this, they will punish them. Similarly, as I said earlier, when you look at the atmosphere, we have just one atmosphere, which is not inexhaustible, which is limited. Particularly developed countries have contributed a lot to climate change. If other individuals and nations, particularly the so-called developed nations, also try to do the same thing, at the end of the day, our atmosphere will be destroyed. And human beings will be destroyed. Non-human beings will be destroyed. And therefore, that makes life meaningless. And that is why I say that we need ethics. And that is why we need globally first, okay? So in different parts of the world, each individual, each society, groups and countries have their own contribution to this. So that's a very important measure. If we don't do this, we cannot address the problem of climate change.
So it looks like we have already several bricks to this new program. We have ethics on climate, and that we have like the good practice for adaptation to climate change. So that's like the different course that could be run into that program. Ramesh, you want to add something?
I mean, I agree on a lot of things with him, but I also say that we shouldn't be so emotional. If you start becoming emotional, you will not really reach to people. In a way, we should be more straightforward as well. The world is divided. There is a politics. Don't forget that. If we say, oh, we are humans, we should, get along, let's go. Yeah, it's a very nice thing, but it won't happen. So as a reporter, as a journalist, you should always tell them to fight against it. It is not, yeah, you should be loyal to the earth. This is planet we all live, whether you are American or European or South Asian or Asian, we all live in the planet. Yes, that's true, but this planet is not uniformly developed. This planet, we have a lot of these inequalities. We have a lot of these trade deficits. We have a lot of other things to deal with. So let's not segregate climate change and tell, oh, it is just an ethical issue only. Yes, people will feel it, but you have to fight against it, yes. But we should be more solid and robust as well. If you find some facts, you should tell them. That is what journalism should do. So we should not really try to make our students more emotional. We should tell them, look, that is the fact, that is true, that is yes, that is no. You understand this, go there, do it, right? So that kind of straightforward things also matter in addition to ethics. And also, a lot of times we are trained in a newsroom or in school is that journalism has deadlines. Yes, we have to rush. But climate science and climate change is not a thing to rush. It will take 30 years to prove something, or 40 years to prove something. So just don't jump into conclusions saying this is climate change or not. There are a lot of other ways to enter. So you don't need to really report on climate change only. You can report something in economy, as you said, and then link towards climate change. There are a lot of ways to really, maneuver somewhere and tell people that the earth matters. It matters to all, whether you are rich, you are poor, it matters, but there are other ways to enter. So if we start making a very narrow window of environment journalists or few people, it won't really work. And I think many times we say we need global effort. Yes, we need global efforts. It is happening, like it took 20 years to get into something. But we also should think that global things are so hard to happen. We should start doing small things at local level and try to push them, the global negotiations telling, look, this is happening in the ground. There are some possibilities. And the good thing that happened in the last few years was a lot of people are telling the alternatives. For example, I don't want to use plastic. Oh, you have that one, take it. Oh, I don't want to use hydropower, or I don't want to dam the river. Oh, you have solar, go for it. So unless you don't really bring new alternatives and tell people that there is value, they won't come in. So more and more alternatives should come, and we should report more and more about that, and the efficiencies of that thing, the good things about those new things. So if you start telling people and then tell them the options as well, they will really go to other options, and then that will be helpful.
That's the new development around journalism for solutions, the solution to try to propose instead of just saying it's like this or it's like that, but we could do it that way. And you wanted, we have to finish. So please just react, both of you, and then we'll take some questions.
I totally agree with the idea of a global network that brings together opportunities like Anne is doing. So I'm excited for that. Probably I'll be the first beneficiary. I also want to agree with you around solutions journalism. It's one of the things that we also train our journalists in the fellowship program to make sure that they're able to cover what are the available responses to issues like climate change in Uganda and in our communities, to make sure that these things can be read or seen on TV and replicated in another community. So if you're talking about a story of someone doing recycling of plastic in Kampala, but another town outside of Kampala is facing a similar challenge, so how can young people read or listen or watch such a story and be able to take it on and replicate it in their community. So yes, there is the whole idea of facing the world and saying this is going on, but the alternatives, as Ramesh is saying, and showing stories of positivity around people who are doing a lot of work to change. Can be government initiatives, can be NGO projects, models that are working in those communities. And that has been inspirational for a lot of our young journalists who now are saying, when I get out of this fellowship of the university, I want to practice journalism. It's another thing because, again, it's a new idea, kind of, that most media houses still are very edgy around the idea of solutions in the media space. Yeah.
Thanks.
But
and you want to finish?
Yeah, two final remarks. The good, and they are positive. First, after this work with, this investigation in 600 coalitions, the good news is that every business, every sector has started its decarbonation revolution. That's a very good news. So it means that for every business area, there's no doubt they have to decarbonize, and they have to change everything in their process of producing goods and etc. That's a good news. The problem is that in most of businesses, they have reached 1 or 5% of what they have to do to decarbonize. And their media have a major role to push them to go fast to make the whole process and be 100% decarbonized. And we have the climate scale just upon us. And the second thing, which is a very personal victory for me, is that for the first time, my chief editor of Challenge magazine, which is the first economic weekly magazine in France, asked me to write about French companies toward the 2 degrees objective. So this is a real victory after 2 or 3 years of pushing this climate and environmental aspects. And so minds can change. And thank you.
No, I think it's but I hope, let's see if we have questions. Thank you, Anne, for this positive note. We have like 10 minutes left because I know there are like other presentation and stuff. Maybe some of you want to ask some questions, so we'll just move with the mic. No? Yeah. Thanks. Oui, bien sûr.
Hello, my name is Khalid. I work for UNESCO, and I'm happy today that we have some of our partners here to discuss climate change and journalism education. I would like, before I ask my questions, just present 2 publications we made for Africa and Asia here. And I can give, we have a lot of copies, so do not hesitate to come and ask for. Those publications are on climate change and are made for journalism educators, so do not hesitate to come. I just have a question because we have discussed about I would say the obstacles concerning the practices of the journalists and the awareness on climate change. But I would like to ask a question concerning investigative journalism, and in particular concerning exogenous factors that could block journalists doing their job. What are the main challenges today for investigative journalists in terms of access to information, in terms of safety as well? Journalists that would like to make an investigative report on climate change on the ground.
Thanks. Investigation, maybe Ramesh, you can tell something about this, and Abaas? No, I think one by one is better.
There are so many challenges in journalism. As other issues have challenges, they just same, right? You know, the threat that you feel when you write about the sand mining in South Asia is terrible. If you write news, you know, the other day somebody will call you and say, "Oh, do you want to leave or not?" You know, so this, I mean, all these environmental things come at cost. So natural resources is being degraded at, you know, at a level. It is unprecedented. And as it was so high in the West, it is really moving to East now. All the countries want to be rich. All the countries are trying to, you know, grab as much resources as possible. So as it moves to East, there are so many, you know, problems that come in. For example, if you report about illegal logging in Cambodia and somebody gets killed, it is about climate change. It is about climate change. If you know, illegally log thousands of hectares of land, you are, you know, you are creating chaos to this planet. So there are a lot of ways to understand, but the first challenge is how do you prepare yourself to report those kind of things? And second is, that is more like an individual safety issue. The second is the governments look very democratic in countries, but if you really hit them, they will really kick back you in different ways. For example, if you write a fantastic story, you publish in your newspaper, and the owner is called by a prime minister, then he will not defend. He will try to impose you, saying, "Hey, okay, look over that issue." Also, that is a survival issue. I have a kid at home. I have to do a job, and if you just kick me out from the newsroom, where should I go? Even I don't tell. That is a threat that I always feel. And this kind of individual threats are very much into the newsroom. You can talk to people, you can talk to journalists, and you can feel the pain that they have. Even they want to do a fantastic, you know, investigative piece, it is hindered by several factors.
But it's a kind of same issue with different subject. As soon as you are getting down in controversy, in things that are not very clean, I mean, you expose yourself to danger. You want to add something?
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting question. If you look at fossil fuel companies, as I said earlier, they have supported disinformation. They give money to some scientists to discredit science, and at the same time to support politicians. Particularly mainstream media are not willing to talk about this because they have financial support from different corporations. And this is a crime against humanity. So to protest against this, journalists should try to raise awareness. And as you know, most of the time politicians are short-sighted. They simply think about 4 years, maximum probably 8 years. So they want to get elected. Therefore, they don't bother about long-range consequences of climate change. So to help solve this problem, therefore, climate scientists and at the same time other concerned groups should try to raise awareness and inform their own people. If you go to the US, for example, very few people know that climate change is taking place in other parts of the world. My colleague, Professor Brown, told me that in the recent past, only 20% of Americans know the fact that climate change is a real problem. Now, he said currently it is growing. About 30% of Americans are aware of this problem. Because usually fossil fuel companies have done a lot to question climate science, climate ethics, and to attack climate scientists. Some Americans, for example, some American scientists who were members of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change were attacked several times. And at the same time, environmental philosophers, including my own colleague and supervisor, Professor Robin at Field, and at the same time, Professor Brown, were attacked for the reason that they try to explain the problem of this climate change and what humanity should do to help solve this problem. So that is why I said that we need to try to raise public awareness, and one day the public itself will protest against its leaders and force its leaders to be accountable to their actions and at the same time to address pressing global environmental problems.
Thank you. Maybe, Abbas, you want to add something, or we move to another question? Or you want, yeah,
Thank you so much for that question. The other thing is on the business model, so advertising. You are a company that depends on a media company. You depend on a big, other maybe fossil fuel company. They contribute to the company budget probably like 70%. The moment you're doing a story against them, investigative story, they just call your editor and say, hey, you risk losing, and then in-house, you just have to accept that that should not be done. It has happened in Uganda. We have also cases where journalists are whisked off when they are covering a story and they're taken maybe like 2 hours out of Kampala, you lose your shoes, transport and everything, and then they tell you, you can walk back to your newsroom and see if you'll be able to be in time to submit your story. And then of course, even some companies investigative journalism is really expensive for media houses, especially in Uganda. So to commission an investigation on climate change probably is not something that a media company would invest in. So you see that some of the investigations in the country are also like collaborations between international media and the local media. So that's one of the solutions that comes into play. But the business model discussion now is timely right now for us to be able to know how does the media, stay independent from such threats.
I would say that the economic weakness of media is a major obstacle, because if we don't have money, it's difficult to have time to investigate. So, but these are internal reasons to the media industry.
Independency issue.
And independency, of course.
Regarding advisors. Maybe another question? I saw somebody. Yeah, please.
Hello, I'm Ramesh Bhushal from University of Manouba, Tunisia. Actually, I'm really interested in that, and I'm an environmental activist in my country. I have something to say to Mrs. Ramesh. What you say is really important, okay? I really appreciate it, but I think it's not enough. When I ask my students, what it is going to be your field when you get the graduation, they tell me politics or economics, sometimes sport, fashion, something like that, but never, ever, ever. I listen to students telling me that I'm going to be in the field of environment or climate. Never happened to me, not even once. So I think the thing about it, and I used to think this when I was a little child, that this environment issue is really boring and it's useless, and what are they talking about? They're kicking us all the time about this climate change and so on, and it's not real. And now I know these facts, I learned about it and so on. Actually, I think what we should do is to make it interesting to our students. Like, for example, take them to some trips, okay, and prepare some sandwiches and give them some certificates. I know it looks like weird, but it's really important. We got to make it interesting. And Mrs. and Mr. Worknish, you said media does not invest in that, okay? Why do we not make environment a business? We make it itself a business. I don't know, there are some travel companies, for example, that are, new, it is brand new in my country, but they are making money from this, taking people to some very great places in my country, or take them to, little trips, and they're making money with this. So why don't the media invest in that and make it a business? And for Mrs. Anne, you said that you want to implant a common e-learning, in a lot of languages. I'm an Arabic professor. I'm your girl. I'll be with you in this project. Don't worry about it. But I don't think it's enough. If you put this on internet, who would see it? If the student is not even interested on that, he would open the internet and see it? Really? I don't think so. I think it is very good, I'm with you in the project, I give my word, but it is not enough. I think that we should add it as a compulsory subject in all high institutes of journalism all over the world. I think we should add it. I mean, we have in all institutes of journalism, we teach English and we teach human rights. Why don't we add, this issue, climate and environment issue, as a compulsory subject?
Okay.
I think this would help a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you for all those questions. Maybe you just like answer.
Yeah, just react, and thank you for your support, and I totally agree with you. This climate change issue should be an option in all curriculum, in all journalism school students. So, but sometimes you just think that you can do, by creating a new tool, you can push things. So, but I agree with all what you said.
Maybe on making news about environment more funny, more like.
Yeah, I got you. Yes, I totally agree that we have to make it fun. We have to make it an experience, and that's what I mentioned in my submission. That when I was young, you taken to a geography trip and you see like stones and how they're changing and all these things, and then you have it in your mind. When you go back, you attach the experience to what you went through, the fun you had with the different, but those programs for universities, you have to have professors or lecturers that are really, have time and really interested in switching the curriculum a little bit. Because in some spaces, I have the curriculum that's cast in stone, I'm not doing anything to change. And then the costs of trips as well, they come into play. Some faculties are really, now organizations like mine come into play, because then I'm able to take a mobile newsroom at your university and provide, a training space that's different from a lecture room, and have them also be part of just another experience besides the usual lecturing. It's going to take time, especially for some countries where curriculums changing takes forever. So support from organizations and other initiatives then come into play on how to make concepts like climate change and other issues more fun and engaging for young people, so that it's an experience of the whole thing rather than just learning and passing an exam.
About the, okay, because I see the time is running quite fast. We have to leave the, yeah, but what I would like to invite people, if they do have questions to you, is that you continue to talk with them, maybe in a place a bit less hot. but finish with this making fun.
The only thing is like, it is the way you make interesting. Your job is to make interesting things. The journalism is to make things interesting, right? But how do you develop interest within yourself is a bigger question. Once you develop interest in yourself, you will become a journalist and you will try to make things interesting. So tell them, hey, just go to rafting, for 10 days. Go to see tigers, rhinos, go to national parks. See, that's a fun, So reporting environment is fun. Tell your student that, you will get a lot of opportunities to travel the world. You will see how this world is. You will see the problems. You will see the tigers, the rhinos. You see the monkeys. You will see the rivers. You will see the Himalayas. You'll see, all the way that we tell them is there is so much opportunity to tell the world that, beautiful things are on this planet, and then tell them that these beautiful things will not be here if you don't report. And that is how you convince them. If somebody comes to me and say, like, I want to be an environmental journalist, I just offer coffee and, talk for 2 hours, say, look at me. I'm doing, you can do it. Go for it. That is how it works. And a lot of people have started calling me, even like every day, almost like every week. Some people say, hey, I want to do this story. Do you have any angle? So it will emerge, and we shouldn't be pessimistic, but we should be optimistic. And there are a lot of people who are wanting to do environmental journalism. Yes, it won't be like political, but it is really increasing.
Okay, so the last word. Thank you.
Yes, it is important to make the subject environment whether it's environmental reporting or environmental ethics, very attractive. In my case, for example, I teach both undergraduate and graduate students, and usually I take my students to rural Ethiopia. So my students observe what is going on in rural Ethiopia and then write a report about their visit. As a matter of fact, they like this subject very much. So it's important to do the same with environmental journalism. And again, as we said, some people rely on economic rationality. As I've said earlier, economic rationality ignores environmental justice, social justice. So let me ask you another question. Do you think that we can build environmentally friendly capitalism? What do you think? Because capitalism runs after profit, doesn't care about environmental issues. Most of the time, transnational corporations externalize environmental and social costs. So some people say that, yes, we don't have any other alternative. Communism failed, therefore we have capitalism. Therefore we have to regulate capitalism. We have to try to make capitalism green. But it's very, very difficult to do so. But as I said earlier, environmental journalists should try to explain the fact that economic rationality alone cannot be the basis of our environmental policy, the basis of our decisions, and so forth. And some organizations or media organizations and so forth also misused environmental issues and try to promote their own vested interest. That is why we said we need ethics. They have to be accountable. So we need objectivity, we need justice, and other important ethical elements to fight against this attempt to misuse even environmental journalism and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And if you want to continue to exchange with the audience, please just go ahead, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jennifer.